thank you very much, Jack, for the invitation. I'm quite honored by it, and I'm very pleased to see Dennis Kent in the audience. And Dennis will recall that he and me did in 1985-86 the first Mesozoic timescale for the DNAC project. And I will, in fact, have a little graph on that later. So thank you, Dennis, for also joining. So timescale 2020 is the follow-up on basically 2012. Why would we make a new timescale? So I will talk about that. I'll talk about methods, and I will briefly deal with Cenozoic, Cretaceous, and Carboniferous. And then I'll have a few slides about the subject of evolution and biostratigraphy, very general. And then we'll have one slide talking about the future timescale. What would be an ultimate timescale look about? And that will probably be quite a discussion. Okay, why would we build a new timescale in 2020? First of all, of course, it's better built, it's more accurate, and it's more precise. Nothing new about it. We have from the about 102 stage boundaries, about 30 have changed age. Between 0.5 and 6 million years, and I'll talk about that big change of 6 million years in the Aption later. When we started, and when I was first in 2000 elected to be chair of the International Commission of Stratigraphy, we had very few formally defined stages. I think it was about 35. At the moment, we have 75 of 103 stage boundaries formally defined. And you could say, well, what does it mean? Well, what it basically means, without going in detail, is that we'll have a stable definition. We can build on that for getting a definitive answer to a potential age. If you don't have a definition, you have to do an ad hoc definition, which can change, and then you get an argument, and then it becomes a little wishy-washy. Basically, the good news is that in 2020, the whole Cenozoic scale is obviously tuned. I'll come back to it later. We have limited cycle scaling in Cretaceous, Jurassic, Lower Triassic, and Carboniferous. What's important is that Dennis Kent, our specialist in the isotopes, in the unstable isotope, the radiometric dates, he has generated about 330 uranium, lead, and argon date, which have generally a very small external uncertainty, and they have, that's the kind of the system of data system on which we built the scale in first order. We have better statistics. I'll come briefly back to that. We have now 45 chapters. We have a large chapter on Phanerozoic Eustacy, 6 chapters on chemostratigraphy. We have 12 chapters on evolution and biostratigraphy. That's totally new. For example, we have a chapter on crystal events, etc. And here are the chapters. So volume 1 has basically the methodology. Volume 2 has the applications with the periods. I'll come back to that later. And there's chapter 4, with Jack very kindly produced an excellent chapter combining his mathematical science together with geology and showing where the challenges are. I think it's a very stimulating chapter, and we're very pleased that Jack has wanted to contribute that. Okay, how do you make a timescale? Well, the principle is very simple and goes back to Harland, the famous Harland scale from Cambridge in the 80s and the 90s. Basically, you have a set of a subdivision, a set of stages, the periods and the stages. Here they have no scale. That's, you kind of define them, and then you scale them. That's on the left side, and the same stages and the periods now have a scale. So you go from the defined through the body of the measuring, the chronometry, to the final time scale. The principle is really very simple. The grandfather of timescale building is Arthur Holmes, he was only 21 years old when he wrote a little book called The Age of the Earth. He was the first to use radiometric ages, radiometric dating to produce a timescale. And when Holmes wrote his first scale, the Earth was only about 1600 million years, thought to be 60 million years old, and now it's over 5 billion. We still use the methodology from Holmes in a way, because in 1960, Holmes made one of his large scales. He apologized for that, and he apologized on that because, first of all, he had a set of radiometric dates. You see them here in little blocks. Here is the linear scale, millions of years. But what is this scale? In order to have this bivariate graph, you have to kind of stack the periods. Well, how do you stack the periods? And Holmes used a system that basically used the cumulative thickness of each period on Earth. He apologizes for that, but he says, I have nothing better. And of course, one of the problems with that is that younger sediments are better preserved, are more readily preserved. So in a way, the older periods would be thinner than the younger periods because of the sedimentation preservation potential. So, but we still use in a way bivariate graphs. I'll come back to that twice. Let me talk briefly about the definitions. Like I said, we have over 70 stage boundaries now with formal definitions. They have the so-called golden spike. Here is Paleozoic, and here is the Mesozoic, Cenozoic. A golden spike is nothing else than a big spike that is hammered into a rock, and that rock has a unique property that it gives the definition, for example, for the base of the Maastrichtian. Yeah. So that is a defined boundary then, and you have to correlate away from that boundary to your own kind of local stratigraphy. This is quite a departure from the classical stratigraphy in which I grew up, where we talked about unit stratotypes. So the unit stratotype would be that a stage has a section and that the rocks in that section are typical of the stage, and that is then the definition of the stage. The trouble is that, of course, the stage then doesn't have a definition of its boundaries. So Hedberg and many others in the 60s, 70s, they have come up with the idea that we should have a definition of the boundaries, so-called global stereotype sections and points, GSSPs, and many people, particularly in the International Commission of Stratigraphy, are working very hard to get all the 103 stage boundaries in the Phanerozoic with definitions, stable definitions. Here is an example of a stable definition. Here is the base of the Cinemanian, the oldest stage in the late Cretaceous, where this gentleman in short pants stands at a level where this particular foraminifer, Planctiforum, has its first occurrence, and that's the formal definition of the Cinemanian. It's in a section in France. Here is the top of the Cinemanian, which is the base of the Turonian, the next stage in the Upper Cretaceous, late Cretaceous, where in this railway cut at the onset of a particular Ammonite, Battinothrus devonense, we have the base of the Turonian. So the Cinemanian is defined between its spike in France and a spike in the US. And that's the total Cinemanian. The problem with this is, of course, is that we don't have the unique rocks of the Cinemanian as a type. And particular people like Fritz Hilgen, I'm not sure he's in the audience, they have been, and others have been trying to get the unit stratotype approved by the International Commission of Stratigraphy. That hasn't happened yet. I'm not quite sure why not, because it's a very elegant idea. But the idea is that they want to fill up all the stage with all the cycles, the astronomical cycles. And then you would have the bottom of the stage, the top of the stage, and the cycles in the stage. And then you have a unit setotype, which is perfect. That's, of course, a fantastic goal. It may be a long time before it happens in the pre-Cenozoic sections, but in the Cenozoic, this appears to be quite doable. I'll come back to that. Here we have the Chinese who are very fond of these boundary setotypes. Here is my Shan section with the little Ammonite, with the little conodont, Hinduella parvus, on top of a little pyramid. Here is the section itself, which is protected in chicken wire, so you will not kind of sample it inadvertently. And you can go around like in a Disney park in a bus and see all the tableaus of life. And so this is the preserved section for the base of the base of the Triassic, the Permian-Triassic boundary, the Paleozoic-Mesozoic boundary. Important. Okay, that's so much about the stratigraphic methodology. Let's look at the general methodology to make a timescale. We have a set of methods: orbital tuning, magnetochronology, track dating, detail dating, and we have methods that derive from mathematics and statistics. Why would we use methods? Well, the reason is very simple. We still, with the 103 boundaries of stage boundaries in the Phanerozoic, I will not talk about Precambrian, I mean the other 4 billion years that has its own complexities. I only talk about the Phanerozoic. We have only 9 stage boundaries in the Phanerozoic with a precise and accurate date. It's quite amazing, but that's true. So a precise date at a ratified boundary, there are only 9 of them. All the other boundaries have dates, but they float away somewhere in the stage. And the trick is to get them to be of use for defining the age of the boundaries itself. And that's what we're dealing with. So here are all the stage boundaries at the moment that have a precise age itself at the boundary. But there are only 9 out of 103. There is Fritz Achterberg, I'll talk briefly about him, our geomathematician in Ottawa, retired, who still very kindly helps out with doing the mathematics for the timescale calculation using cubic splines and various other methodologies for the uncertainty. Okay, I talked about Mark Schmidt. Mark has done a very good job with giving an appendix in the book that has the radiometric dates that we need. It's very well organized. Here is the date, and here is the continuation of that. So there is where the date comes from, the actual age with the internal and external uncertainty of the date, the type of date, how many zircons or what type of argon, and the bias thread, and then the Kronos thread and the reference. And this is very important, and this is very well organized at the moment. When we did the first timescales with Dennis Kent in '86 and 1919 scale and even the 2004 scale, we had large discrepancies between argon and uranium-lead dates. And Amsterdam and Utrecht schools, Kuiper et al. In 2008 published a very elegant paper synchronizing the rock clocks of Earth's history, where they basically combined argon dates, an argon date with a uranium-lead date with an astrochronology date, in effect, in the area where I did my PhD in Crete, quite funny, many years ago. And now these 3 methodologies are tightly calibrated. The result was that the argon method, which had with its relative method, you have to calibrate it relative to a standard. First of all, the ages became slightly older and the uncertainty was less. And the uranium-lead dates itself have been much improved. And we can, at the moment, say that many uranium lead dates have much more precision than a potential biostratigraphic assignment and correlation. And argon-argon is also on its way to kind of compete with uranium lead and become very, very precise. After the radiometrics, of course, what we really want to do is get as much possible astronomical calibration of our rock records in the standard cycles. And of course, I will not talk about this all, but basically Lascar and all the colleagues that deal with this, they know much more about it, but we have this idea that we have orbital cycles, climate cycles, and lithology cycles in the rock record. This is the famous section in Sicily. It's Fritz Hilgen and colleagues have mapped in great detail. And the trick is that you will understand that, yes, in this section, there are orbital cycles that, of course, are controlled by changes in climate, which again modulates the lithology. But you want to go from lithology through climate to the orbital cycles and say, yes, we have these orbital cycles in the rock section. That's what it's all about. Now, I will not deal with it in detail, but just for those that haven't seen this slide, this is one of the famous slides from the Lawrence and Hilgen group in Utrecht, where we basically have an astronomical solution from Lascar or another specialist. Here, we have an observed record, which is here, which is in this case based on the section in Sicily. And if you can tie them one by one, you can calibrate the observed record exactly to the mathematical cycles. It sounds very simple, but of course, in actual practice, that is many, many years of work. And it's very time consuming to do this, but it's also very elegant. I will not go any further, but there's one important thing with this. That is that in all science, we like to have not only one set of data, we like to have two or more sets of data to confirm that our hypothesis is correct. So in this case, the groups in Lamont from Hayes and the groups in Cambridge with Shackleton et al. Could determine that exactly what Hilgen and Lawrence and others and Dijksman found in Utrecht and with the Italian scientists found in the Mediterranean rock record, they could find the identical sections calibrated in the same way in the Neogene, in the ocean, in the deep sea and ocean drilling record. And so that vital step going from the Mediterranean to the ocean drilling record with the same time to cycles has in fact put the Neogene timescale in the book. Here is the Neogene timescale. This is in fact the Miocene. We have Heiko Pelike, not sure he's in the audience today. He made for the Cenozoic timescale in 2020. He did all the cycle work and calibrated all the zonations and the stages and the periods and the isotopes to the fully orbitally tuned Cenozoic scale. And what's more important even than that alone is the fact that the Hilgen group with colleagues have been able to formally get approved by the International Commission of Stratigraphy that the Miocene, the Neogene, sorry, is now calibrated with 4 or 5 thousand years astrochronozones. So the astrochronozone is the formal unit, geochronological unit, that you use to calibrate away from the standard Neogene towards your local record. And how you do that, that's of course what it's all about. But we have a very elegant Neogene now that is fully orbitally tuned. What's important with all these calibrations and correlations is that we have very detailed high resolution carbon isotope and oxygen isotope curves. I will not deal with that in detail, but because many of you know much more about than me, all I want to say, as I skip this graph then, is that the record, particularly with the continuous coring in the ocean drillings inventory of sites, we have an unbelievable good understanding of many of those isotope boundaries through the rock record. Here you see Alan Thomas looking at PETM, which is the base of the definition of the base of the Eocene, the global thermal maximum, PETM, very nicely expressed in this core. And here we have the 2020 scheme as drafted by Gabiok in the US. Here we have the oxygen isotopes, and we have the carbon isotopes. Here we have the PETM. And all these wiggles are now nicely calibrated to they're tuned. And so we have a very good idea of the age with a precision that is far better than we ever had before. And there it's calibrated to the dinoflagellates with a second order correlation. In the Cretaceous, we have a problem that a large part of the Cretaceous has no geomagnetic signal, but we have very good signals with the isotopes. Andy Gale, who made the Cretaceous scale for times 2020, did a very nice job on that in a very large chapter, has spent a lot of time on showing in literature what the ages of the major carbon excursions in the C13 excursions in the Cretaceous. Here we have OE1, and here is the OE2, the Bonnerelli. And these excursions are very important because they are essentially global, and they can be recognized in both marine and in non-marine environments, which is very, very important. Freshwater, marine. Here we have the Bonnerelli OE2 in Germany. You see a very nice expression of the dark shales in this otherwise light-colored section with a very nice cyclic signal of limestones, Turonian, Cinemanian boundary. The Cretaceous scale, which was produced by Frits Achterberg after the input from Jim Hawke, Andy Gale, Jörg Mutterloos, and a number of others, is shown here. Here are all the raw data, as you call it, consisting of events of the microfossil record, boundaries of stages defined by cycles, and a number of isotope, stable isotope excursions with dates. They are organized along this relative scale here, and along this scale are a set, we have the linear scale, we have here a set of radiometric dates also. So this is a composite of a large body of information on which we have an idea about the age, which is then directly plotted against this scale. And what is this scale itself? This whole body of information is also put in a so-called composite, where we try to scale using independent means the events such that we have an independent scale, which can be a function of the number of cycles between events. It can be a function of the fact that we think that we have the distance, and it goes back to the distance in kilometers, and it goes back to the Kent and Gradstein 1986 scale, where we had a number of tide points of the magnetochrons on the seafloor in the Pacific. We had their age. We had the distance of these crons in kilometers on the seafloor, and we had their age here, and we could draw a line, and we drew a straight line, a best fit line, and then we reinterpolated with the definitions of stages via this chronogram to come to an age of the stage boundaries in the Cretaceous. and in the Upper Jurassic. And exactly the same is done here. So a number of these events also can be scaled using the magnetochronology, and that whole body yields a composite along this scale. Here we have the radiometric dates set up along this scale, and then Fritz Achterberg invariably finds that both in the Upper Cretaceous, Lower Cretaceous, we have a best fit line, which looks like the best fit is a straight line. And if you interpret that straight line then with the definition of the stage boundaries, you get the age of the stages, boundaries itself. That is the principle of making the Cretaceous timescale. The big change in 2020 is the fact that there has always been controversy about the base of the Aption. There has been literature saying for years that we were totally wrong. The age should be much younger. And we stubbornly stayed with this 126 or even 125 age of the base of the Aption, using a large body of radiometric dates. That is kind of complex to talk about in detail, and we believe that was correct. However, it turns out that we were probably wrong, and the largest change in the Cenozoic, in the whole Phanerozoic time scale is the fact that the Aption has gone from 13.3 to an 8 million years duration, which is a very large change, of course. So the long Aption, 30 million years in the past, used the Psychosatigraphy of the Piobico core in Italy. Relative to an uranium lead date of 113 million years for the base of the Albion, and then you simply count down from the base of the Albion, which again with the cycles is tied to the base of the Cinemanian above it. So we know the duration of the Albion. We know from the cyclostratigraphy the duration of the Aption, and with the radiometric dates at key type points, we go from a floating scale to a stable scale and say, yes, the base of the Aption is 126, etc. However, there has been arguments that we were wrong. For example, Martinez came in 2015 already up with the idea that using very good dating, that the Hauterivian boundary was also 126 million years, and then you have a problem. So the Barremian wouldn't exist, which is nonsense. So we start to kind of convert to the fact that we believe a large body of information that we used is incorrect, because in Spitsbergen, there is a date done by a number of people at Oslo University that has been recalibrated now by a student from GMOC and GMOC himself and others using magnetostratigraphy to apply that the base of the Aption starts at 121. Which fits very nicely with new ideas about the spreading rate by Malinverno, 2012. And using this body of information, we believe that basically the Piobico core is wrongly cycled. There's a problem with the Piobico core, and it looks like that part of the cyclicity is either duplicated or there is something else going on. They're not astrocycles. I understand also that the base of the Piobico core apparently is somewhat controversial, because it looks like that there are turbidites in the system that kind of give you a difficult signal. So we have converted from the long Aption to the short Aption, which has implications also for the base of the Cretaceous Jurassic age boundary all the way down to the mid-Jurassic. So here is the geological time scale for the Cretaceous and the Jurassic and the Triassic through time, going all the way from Holmes through the Hug scale with the Glockonites, which I don't want to talk about, very young, to the 2020. And you see there are less and less changes taking place through the system, but then with this Aption change, we see here a very large change from 2012 to 2020, where the Aption base becomes much younger. and it of course draws up, then pulls up a little bit the base of the Cretaceous, all the way till about the Boeotian in the Jurassic. I'm sure there will be much more talk about this in the future in literature, but we believe we are finally on the right track. We still have then to explain a set of radiometric dates on geos in the Pacific, on Tongavan Plateau, on ocean crust that is of a so-called good certain chronostratigraphic age, but apparently has the wrong radiometric age of the sediments on top of that ocean crust. And that's something that I'm sure there will be more discussion about and is needed. So basically the scale is better defined, it's more accurate and more precise. I'll jump and go to the Carboniferous, where we had large ice sheets in the high latitudes of southern Gondwana, here in white. And we have a very, very dramatic cyclic response, which has been studied in great detail, both in the Donets Basin in Russia and in North America by Haeckel et al. With the famous cyclothems. Here is Marcus Aretz, who wrote a very, very nice chapter on the Carboniferous for the time scale. This body of information, the cyclothems in the Donets Basin versus the cyclothems in the Midwestern interior of the US, with its calibration, has been studied in great detail also by means of the isotope by Davidov and Schmidt and others. And it seems to be a rather stable body of information, quite unique, where we don't have a floating scale, but we have a very nicely calibrated, hard cyclic scale with good radiometrics for what is called the Pennsylvanian of the Carboniferous, so the upper Carboniferous. The cyclicity is very spectacular. This is Bear Island in between Norway and Spitsbergen, an uninhabited island. There are no bears there. It's not calibrated in the sense that you can date it directly because it's a non-marine section with it's very difficult to date, but the cyclicity is spectacular. And here is a colleague of mine looking at this cyclicity. You go from the non-marine red beds with plants to the coral beds here, the coral heads here in this marine section, and it's repetitive for about 40 or 50 meters over an interval of about 2 million years. Very spectacular. But it cannot be used yet for the time scale because we don't have good type points yet with radiometrics or with microfossils or with isotopes to go away from this section to the actual abstract scale itself. So here is the Carboniferous itself, with the famous Achterberg graph, where we have basically the composite standard developed by Davidov and others with the cycles and all the fossil record, which is scaled in various ways versus a large body of radiometric dates. So you have radiometric dates versus a composite, what's called the composite standard, which you can ask questions about, and I can try to answer how you do that. But it's in itself, it's quite tedious and somewhat I would say sometimes a little bit controversial process. But you get the best fit line, and with the best fit line, you have a nomogram where you can kind of find out what the age of your state boundaries is if you know the age of which, if you know the definition of the stages. So here we have the Carboniferous and also the Permian scale with the chronogram of age versus composite standard. Notice that in general, you would expect this line to be reasonably linear. If not, then there's a problem. There will be some modifications of the linearity. We don't have a full understanding of why, but it has to do probably with variations in sedimentation rates. but it's reasonable linear, and that's what you would expect. Okay, that brings me close to the end of my talk. I'd like to give a few slides on what is called evolution in biostratigraphy. The philosophy of these mini chapters done by specialists in these groups like trilobites, graptolites, chitinozoans, conodons, ammonites, ammonoidea, nanofossils, forams, etc., plant spores, is that yes, we always had very nice chapters on magnetostrat by Jim Ogg. We had radiometric isotopes by Schmidt. We had strontium by MacArthur. We had osmium by Peuker. We had sulfur by, what's the name? Sorry. And Athena. We had oxygen. We had carbon. But we never talked about the fossils. We assumed that they were kind of there, floating around and being helpful. So we figured out we should have some short chapters on evolution in biostratigraphy, and these specialists have done that. And I think that has been is an improvement to the timescale book, and particularly to the teaching on the timescale book. So here is Kerb, Mangerud, and Gradstein, my brother, who's a specialist in tropical plants, who wrote a very nice chapter on plant spore pollen stratigraphy in about 6 pages with nice graphs where you see how the phytosphere, not only the zoosphere, but the phytosphere developed on Earth through time. We have Andy Gale and colleagues did the Ammonites, very, very important. There's Ammonite, Ammonoidea for the Paleozoic and for the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. There's a little bit of text on the taxonomy, the evolution, and on their use for biochronostratigraphy. There is Maria Rose Petrizzo with Richard Wade and myself on the Planktic Foraminifera for Jurassic, Cretaceous, and Jurassic, which is kind of state of the art, how the taxonomy develops towards the biostratigraphy, towards the chronostratigraphy. All right, then we come almost to the end. We should talk a little bit about the physical timescale 2000XX. That is just a target. First of all, you'll be surprised how many people ask me, what's the definition of the lower Eocene? Well, the answer is lower, middle, and upper is not defined. In fact, the Eocene it is, but I'll tell you that in the Companion, lower and middle and upper is not defined. And then oil people get annoyed and say, what's the use of the scale? I want to know what the lower Aption is. I said, there is no definition of lower Aption yet. It may come, it's subjective. We hope that sometimes in the future, not too far away, all 103 stages will have definitions, and that also the subdivision of the stage itself will be addressed. That's happening at the moment in the Devonian and in the Carboniferous, I believe, maybe in the Ordovician, but it's wanting in the Jurassic and Cretaceous and the Triassic. I think that ultimately, with the good work that Jacques is now heading, and I'm sure will have very good results, we will ultimately not only have a stable Cenozoic, but also a stable Cretaceous and Jurassic scale using defined 4 or 5 year kilocycles. Which means that essentially we would have a near deterministic post-Triassic Geologic timescale. We have the truth, whatever the truth is, but we have a truth. With a much denser network of uranium, lead, and argon dates, we will probably get an even better set of data with the radiometric ages. There will always be issues with zircon crystallization and some other noise, but it looks like that the combination of the very good dates together with better statistics will ultimately get a more detailed, still probabilistic Cambrian through Triassic timescale. And that would then give them the global geologic timescale for global deep time Earth sciences. When it will happen, we can discuss. with the Cenozoic, we have seen a spectacular advance now that we have a totally orbitally tuned, which will be very helpful for high resolution correlation all over the world. I think for Cretaceous and Jurassic, this will happen in the future. And the Paleozoic, the Paleozoic and the lower Mesozoic will probably benefit a lot from a much better and denser network of radium-lead dates. For example, in Triassic, we still need a lot of extra dates, particularly in the Norian, the longest dates of the whole Jurassic, of the whole Paleozoic, where we basically have only 2 dates. 21 million years with 2 dates is by no means enough. We have scaling, but there are lots of other issues there, and we still have to work very hard on, for example, on what understand what Norian is. And that brings me to the end of my talk. I thank you very much for listening to me. We have had about 100 contributors. Jim Ork has worked very hard. Mark has done a marvelous job. Gabi is unbelievably good in the drafting. It's all standardized. I thank you very much. And please, if you have questions, thank you.
So thank you a lot, Felix, and for the nice talk and for this tremendous work. We thought it would never come in 2020, but you did it.
Right, it did come, yeah, right.
So now there is time for questions. So please raise your hand you click on the raise hand stuff to ask for question and.
All right, yeah, I have to wait one. Right. I should get rid of this, I guess. Well, I can go back to the first one.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, questions?
Nobody has any questions on the... I have one, but which is quite general question is, so you are thinking of the next one? 2028?
Well, that's not so simple. The issue is that I am almost 80 years old. I think I should stop doing this. And the problem is that neither Jim Ork or Mark Schmidt is very keen on working with a very large group of people. They have a network, but they think that they should work in a different way. So I'm not entirely sure that there will be a big book in the future. There will be a 2024 small time scale, the concise, that I'm sure Jim and Gabi and maybe me will work on that, which is basically just a pocket. So it may show some improvements, but it doesn't deal so much with methodology. But the issue of another book is basically up in the air.
Because one thing is the final timescale, but I think the pedagogical use of this book is as much important, maybe, as the final timescale. No.
Yeah, well, I mean, I should maybe show this slide, which I didn't show. What's important with the timescale is the following. In 2004, we brought out the first kind of book, and then people said they really could see what the problems were. So the Timescale Foundation was formed. We got the Kronos project. With 2012, we got the Earth-Time project, and those projects basically worked very hard on all the problems that existed with the timescale. And so, on once the book had input in Earth time, but Ørstem also had a very important input in the 2020 scale. And this will happen in the future. And I think the really what I feel good about is this interaction between a book yields a lot of ideas and work on getting better data, which again can have a new book. But if it actually should be an actual book or let's say an interactive website where with some authorities we would say we have a stable scale, that's something to be discussed. But I think Jack's question is important in the fact that in my idea, there should basically be an independent body of scientists that kind of helps to standardize the scale. We have in Paris the World Geological Map, which is an independent body that deals with all the geological surveys in the world and brings out maps and helps out with regional maps and has a standardized set of colors, abbreviations, and uses a standard scale for the scaling. And in the same way, there could be an independent body like the World Geological Timescale somewhere in the world with specialists that guard the so-called scale and work on improvements. And we don't really need a big book. Yeah. Anyway, this is just an idea, but I think that this is something that should be discussed.
Any comments on this point by the audience?
Well, I just have a question related to that. There is, of course, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and now a new subcommission on timescale calibration. What role do you see for that potentially, or not? What are the complications?
Yeah, no, but that's an important question. Thank you. The reason that we brought out the Timescale Foundation was that we felt that with Diemok and others was that we felt that the International Commission of Stratigraphy is very good in stratigraphy, but geochronology is much wider than just stratigraphy. There are many more disciplines involved. I mean, Jacques Lascar is not in the International Commission of Stratigraphy. Mark Schmidt is not in the International Commission of Stratigraphy. So the calibration project set up by what's his name? Our friends in Wisconsin and others is very useful, but it doesn't specifically want to make timescales, if I understand. Is that correct?
I'm not a total expert, but my understanding is that they made a new subcommission specifically for timescale calibration to focus, to indeed fill this gap that exists in the ICS right now.
Yeah, if that becomes functional, then I think it will be very important.
Yeah, I think Mark is vice president of that subcommission, Mark Schmidt.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm aware that I have not followed all the latest, but I'm aware of that this is happening. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, right. Well, thank you for bringing it up.
I've got another question or comment. So on the early Cretaceous, the reason we push to move the ages towards younger ages is because we worked with Beatriz Aguirre Ureta in Argentina, and we got in Argentina Psychosatigraphy, but also good Ammonite record and 4 uranium-lead ages, and that we don't have in the Tethyan area. And so it happens that in the active margins, not only we have good Ammonites and sometimes Psychosatigraphy, but also much more ash layers that can provide geochronological ages. And so my question is, in then most of the stratotypes and the GSSPs that we want to cycle calibrate are defined on passive margin. But in the end, because in active margin we have more possibilities to get absolute ages from ash layers, I wonder if sometimes I wonder if we would not better define also over stratotypes, sometimes to stratotypes in or GSSPs in active margin.
Thank you for bringing this up. This is important. I've always been amazed that there have been no more dates for the Jurassic in Japan come up. I think there is great potential, and I'm not quite familiar why we haven't had more input from the active margin, for example, along the western parts of the Pacific.
Yeah, I think there is a bias. For a long time, we worked much more on the passive margin, because it was easier, because we could work on more global phenomena. And actually, the study of active margin may be sometimes more difficult because, of course, of a stronger tectonic control, but can also provide much more, not much more, but additional, very interesting data in terms of chronology.
Yeah, no, you're entirely right, and I entirely agree that this is important, and it will also help solve some of, for example, if you get many more radiometric dates from Japan in the Jurassic, which I think is feasible, then we would probably very quickly see where our scaling problems are in the Jurassic. There are distinct scaling problems in the stages that we haven't solved at all.
Many thanks, and many thanks for the.
Any other question?
I have another question, if I may. It's a bit of a technical question, Felix, but I was wondering, like, what's your view on the role of cyclosatigraphy in the Paleozoic and in the Triassic, especially like you mentioned cyclosatigraphy as an important technique to determine the position in scale, right? When you're doing the cubic spline fit, you have to put all the ages in some thickness scale, and cyclosatigraphy can play a role there. But wouldn't it be interesting as well to let cyclosatigraphy play a role in determining the slope of the fitting line that ultimately goes through all the dates?
Yeah, good question. Thank you, David. We can talk about this a long time. I mean, I am not such a, I mean, I don't have all the facts handy, but one thing I will not show it here because we get way off is that I've been working with Schmidt on the so-called superspline. The superspline now is nothing else than combining the splines in the book for Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian. We managed to make a spline for the Jurassic, Triassic. Don't ask me how, it was not easy. And we have a spline for the Cretaceous. We made a super spline from the base of the Ordovician to the top of the Cretaceous. And it is almost a straight line. I can show it you. I mean, we'll publish it. I mean, we should maybe send it to you so you can comment about it, because Fritz Achterberg is very keen to get feedback. But of course, there is some mathematics in there and a little bit of assumptions. But the fact that it's almost a straight line on that scale shows that we are on the right track. But your question is very important because, sure, in a big sense, we are on the right track. But in great detail, like you saw for the Carboniferous, the Permian, we have very nice data for the Pennsylvanian. We have absolutely no data for the mid-Permian. We have no data for the for the top of the Mississippian. I mean, we lack an enormous amount of information, and that line if you stretch it really over a long period is straight, but in detail it's not straight at all. So I would think that getting more cycles is the best thing. The trouble is that it seems to be fraught with problems. I mean, I don't want to get in an argument with you that know much more about this Devonian than me, but I can tell you that if you read the timescale book in detail and you believe the work from Mark Schmidt et al. For example, for the younger part of the Devonian, it doesn't fit at all with the very nice work that was done on the Frasnian and on the Fermanian. It doesn't fit. And the question is then, for sure, we have fantastic Frasnian in the Midwestern interior, done by specialists and students, and you know more about than me. But for some reason, they've either missed cycles or they counted too many cycles. I think they missed cycles in this case. So the stage is longer than the number of cycles when you scale with the cycles. And so do you say, well, Mark Schmidt is wrong? Well, in this case, the dating is so fantastically good and so detailed that I believe the radiometrics is still better than the cycles. So the problem here is that we have to solve these internal different problems between the disciplines before we can get back to improving the scale. Is this okay?
Especially in the Devonian, the mismatches, for example, in the Pragian, they are threefold or so.
Well, but there's a definition problem with the Pragian, isn't it? Yeah. That's the problem.
Yeah, I'm talking there. You can talk about the short and the long Pragian as well.
Yeah,
now we're getting very technical, so we can do that another time.
No, but you know much more about it than me. But I mean, I was really appalled when I saw the discrepancy that we still come up with in the Devonian. And I think part of the problem is that we don't have a composite standard of high quality for the Devonian. Becker was simply not interested in making it. I pushed and pushed and pushed Thomas Becker, and he doesn't want to do it. And this is, I think, is a problem. You have the color donations, but they don't scale it.
All the same duration.
Right, yeah. Yeah, right.
Any other comment or question to Felix? Paul, you had a comment you put on the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to remind folks that when we first started using the 405K cycle back in 1986, when it was 413,000 years, not 405, that the marine community basically thought it didn't exist. We've been using that for lacustrine sequences since, and I think had some pretty good success. But I'm a little bit, I guess, I feel that while the marine sections are obviously very important and the marine environment covers 70% of the world, we live on the continents and a lot of evolution occurs there, and time doesn't recognize the difference between the marine and the ocean. And so I think that by applying carefully designed experiments that provide uranium lead dates and magnetic stratigraphy and orbital tuning, we can perhaps move a little faster in some areas, especially in the pre-Cenozoic. Okay, you're shaking your head, Felix. Tell me why.
No, yeah, no, that's, yeah, sure, I shake my head. The reason that I shake my head is that we had quite a bit of argument, somewhat heated, between Jim and me about, for example, the base of the Campanian, I believe, where we have a non-marine core in a lake bed, in a fossil lake bed succession in China. This was important for oil and gas. And they had one radiometric date, and then eventually they got some cyclostratigraphy. And it misfitted quite a bit the scaling which we had done using the post the Campanian Maastrichtian using the cycles in the marine record. and the scaling with the magnetochronology after the quiet zone. There was a discrepancy, and Jim insisted that the data from this single core in the non-marine record in China was so good that we should use it. And I refused. I said, it's only one record. I mean, I love it that there is no data, but in my mind, it's again, it needs an extra core to get the correlation right. And so I think we kind of, I think that we try to kind of look at both and then come up with some kind of interpolation. I don't have all the data exactly in my head at the moment, but there was definitely a problem that the fantastic record in the non-marine record was only one section, was only one core section. And that was not enough for me to say this is a standard.
So how about the late Triassic, 30 million
Yes,
years?
well, we use the palisades, of course, a lot. But there are the problems are there is that the Raytheon is a miserable state because they don't have a definition of the boundary they agree upon. So first in 2012, we had the long Raytheon, now we have the short Raytheon. And I don't know who is right or wrong, but there seems to be a problem of people.
The 400K cycles don't care about the Iridium Northern.
No, I know, but if you want to make a time scale, you need a definition of the stages.
Okay.
That's what I'm not arguing with the cycles at all. I think the cycles in the Palisade are fantastic. And there is magnetochronology. So I think it could use more radiometric dates because the Norian is still very, very long, 21 million years. And we have only one date at the bottom, and I'm not sure that you have cycle scaling all the way to the bottom of the Norian. Maybe you have. I'm sorry, that Jim did the work. I don't remember.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any other question, comment? Okay, so I don't see any other additional questions. So we have to thank you again for this nice talk. And I thank everybody for attending. I think it was, I have the impression it was quite okay with the connection and all the technical detail. And I'm glad that we were able to have both people from various countries in Europe, also from the US. I don't know if we had people from China. I'm not sure, but maybe in some next session. And I remind you that our next talk in this series will be on January 12, and will be on the jet coring project, which will be probably they will have just finished the coring by the time. And it will be given by Steve Esselbo. And for those who are not already registered in our list, please, if you want to be informed of the next session, as I put in the chat, just send me an email at jacques.lascar@gmail.com. So you will be sure to have the next announce and the next link for this talk. And it seems that it always, you know, I made the announce. I didn't know exactly how many people would be attending, but I think it's nice. I think we have quite a nice. I see quite a nice community here. I hope you will be here. You will be still present in the next session. And so I thank you all again, and see you then on January 12.